won't say a word. Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird won't sing, Mama's gonna buy you a diamond ring.
Hey guys, this week's story comes to us from the subreddit known as No Sleep. Its title is,
I quit the police force 8 years ago, but I still remember this.
I hope you enjoy it.
Part 1.
I've never used Reddit before. Serena said it was a good place to get advice and vent. She let me use her account, and, well, my shrink said I need to write stuff down, so here it is. I've already written it all down, of course, in my official statement, and then hours and hours of paperwork afterwards, but that's always formal. It always leaves out parts of it in an attempt to sound professional, so here goes. I wish I could say I was in the police force for years. I wasn't. I was still in probation when I left. A lot of seasoned officers did too, so I don't note it as a failure. Just crappy luck and timing, which seems to be a pattern with me. To be fair to him, Stevens, the officer in charge, didn't want me there. I thought it was more macho hazing bullshit when he said it wasn't something for a probie, but for once, it was just him looking out for me. I'll always respect him for that. Either way, it didn't help. I was put on the job, and here I am. The house was pretty typical, Surrey rich guy. You can't actually see the house from the road. Big black and gold gates that take about 10 minutes to open. Huge driveway, and a fountain with an angry-looking mermaid in the middle of it. A house big enough to fit my entire block of flats, and huge double doors that I doubt had ever been properly opened. Hedges cut into ridiculous shapes. You get the idea. There was a cluster of journalists already outside the gates, usually the sign that things are about to get interesting. I only caught snippets of what they said, something about experiments and is it true one of the suspects was still alive. This part was true. Mr. and Mrs. Somerton lived there with their adopted son Marshall, when the police followed up on an anonymous call earlier in the day. Mr. Somerton slashed his wife's throat and then tried to do his own. Luckily, Jones managed to slow the bleeding for long enough to get him into an ambulance. But just last week, we'd arrested a man for beating his wife to death. Sad to say that a man murdering his wife doesn't really warrant this much excitement. It happens every week. Just as we'd parked, up Cox came running out and threw up all over the outside steps. It'd be funny, but he'd been on the force for 25 years. A cocky bastard because of it, but today his face was completely gray. He gave me a look of pity when I walked past and into the foyer. The kid, well, if 23 is a kid, Marshall, looked gaunt and was being questioned and taken care of by some others I hadn't seen before. There was blood all over the kitchen where Mrs. Somerton had bled out and more smeared over the expensive cabinets where obviously the husband struggled. I wondered why he didn't touch the boy. Male murders/suicides include children a lot of the time. Maybe adopted kids didn't have the same sort of stats. That sounds a bit detached, but you get that way even after just a few months. Then I saw the first one. We'd call her Mur later because that's what another one Uni called her. They all had names like that. She was in a seat, crying with a blanket covering her legs and a puddle of something pink at her feet. The officer beckoned us over and said we need to call for some wheelchairs. About 8 of them, but probably 10 to be sure. I got a closer look at Mur then. To start with, she was naked under the blanket, which only draped over parts of her. Her legs. Jesus. What used to be her legs were pressed hard together, and the inside had the ragged swirls of burn scars as far up as I could see. Later, I knew they went all the way up, sewn and almost melted together. The outsides were red and white. Closer, I could see that they looked like scales etched into her flesh over and over again, and then scarred over time. This wasn't new. She'd lived like this for at least a few months. Her feet, Her feet weren't feet anymore. They'd been deboned, the skin stretched, and flapping uselessly at the bottom of her ankles. I can only imagine the agony she'd been through. She hadn't been born like that. When she raised her head, I saw her eyes were completely black, and then she sang, "Can I take the contacts out now?" The officer with her told her she can stop singing. She told us that she wouldn't stop singing. We tried to tell her it was okay. She could do whatever she wanted, which included not singing and taking contact lenses out. Stevens went to try and find a jumper and skirt to dress her in, while I just stood there with no idea what I was meant to do. She took one contact lens out and then another, the whites of her eyes red and sore from wearing them. The sight of it almost made me tear up. Her real eyes were blue, and I realized then just how young she was. 15, maybe 18 at a push. This little angel face looking up at me from a jumble of scars with her hands shaking. "Where's Marshall?" She just said it this time, whispering as if she was scared someone would know she spoke. I guess she was worried about the kid. I told her he was okay and going to the police station to make a statement. When she felt ready, we'd ask her to do the same. I had no idea what to do here. I just gave her shoulder a squeeze that I hoped was reassuring and connected with bare skin, kicking myself for it, and I told her I'd find her some clothes now. Stevens was coming down the stairs with a pile of them.
Sick people kept her in the swimming pool. No idea for how long.
I must have looked confused.
She's called Mur, apparently, short for mermaid. Somerton was a surgeon, some big shot heart guy in the city, unclogging fat bankers. This is his hobby. There's no way they won't convict on this if he doesn't die first.
Uni came in, crawled. If you'd shown me a picture of him on the internet, I would have laughed, but no, he was huge. Massive muscles rippling over his shoulders and totally naked like Mur. He crawled over her on his knees and knuckles, looking like he was used to it. Apart from crawling, he had one major modification. A bone horn jutting out of his forehead. There was no strap, nothing, just a hole and then white shining bone coming out. Another surgery. And a tail, long and black. At this point, I almost didn't notice it. I didn't notice the scars where his Achilles tendon had been cut out either. I'd find out about that later.
Unicorn.
Stevens whispered at me.
There's tons of them. No idea how many. Have you called for the wheelchairs?
He handed me the clothes and looked pissed off when I shook my head. I could barely speak. Mur and Uni were hugging, both crying when I came over with the clothes for both of them. I didn't want to intrude, but heard Mur quietly singing again, telling Uni that Marshall was at the police station and Mr. Somerton was alive. He just shook his head and put a t-shirt on. When I headed outside for a quick breather and to make the call, the mermaid fountain looked cruel, like it was there to taunt everyone who came here. By the way, there were more victims in that house. Hey guys, stay tuned for part 2.
Hey guys, welcome back. You're now gonna hear
Part 2.
I'm sorry I can't get all this down in one go. There's a lot to tell and it's hard to go through it again, but I think it helps. Before I get on to the other stuff, the adoption and the Somertons, I need to just tell you about the place and the people in it, the modifications. I didn't notice a lot about the house when I first went in. Only after months of going there, looking at photos, working through it until I finally quit, did I see all of it. There were too many details to notice everything all at once. A lot of them would look normal or just a bit quirky in any other house, but when you have fairy tale nightmares in every room, it becomes something else. Like patterns in the wallpaper. You don't really notice them until you look, or rather, until Stevens gets pissed off at you and tells you to look. In the giant hall, it was gold on cream, woodland scenes with fauns and nymphs, classical paintings with sirens, or mermaids, harpies in picture frames, chimera, I didn't even know what the last two were until this case. All mythical animals or from fairy tales. Bookshelves full of them. The only books in this place were either fairy tales, myths, or anatomy textbooks. The place could seriously use some Andy McNabb. It was an iceberg house. One of those places where there was more in the basement than there was overground. It was an entire world down there. The first one is normal enough for where it is. A huge swimming pool with loungers all around it and a mirrored ceiling. It's where Mur lived, forced to float singing in the pool for years since she was kidnapped and changed. She was actually 19, but what difference does that make? She was a bit of a rebel. Went out and got drunk with some other friends just before her 16th birthday and woke up further down in the basement. Under that, there was a garage where they kept all their cars, some with blacked out windows. We know now sometimes they traveled with the people they imprisoned. They had a chalet in Switzerland, a villa in the south of France, and didn't like traveling without a few companions. Everywhere was private enough. We had to talk to Interpol to see if there were others there, but not many. The Somertons liked to keep them close. Under that again, that's where they were modified. There were 26 cells on one level, each with a toilet and a sink, each with a bed and chains, restraints, and a gap in the steel door to look through. On the level below that, there was an operating theater with 2 chairs in the corner, I assumed for people to watch. I wished we'd got down there sooner. We only managed to get through the steel door 4 days after we first found the place. There were 3 recovering patients in the cells. All of them had died in the wait. There were so many bedrooms. The place could have been a hotel. Apart from Mur and the swimming pool, they all had their own habitat. Most of them right there in the house. How they didn't just kill them in their sleep, I'll never know. There were no locks on the bedroom doors. They just stayed there. There were dozens of them in the house and around it. I'm embarrassed to say that I don't remember them all by name, but here are the ones that I do. I do remember that the Somertons had been doing it for almost 17 years. There were bodies found in the garden too, but the oldest was Fawn. He'd been there for 15 years when we found him. I didn't read much of this stuff as a kid. I know a lot of people do. After seeing this, I have no idea why, but that's fairy tales for you. Kids' TVs always creep me out a bit. Fawn was a guy living in the woods. They'd made him his own house. It looked like something from The Hobbit. Like I said, they could all technically leave, but do what? Most of them were too ashamed by the time they'd been changed. Some of them took years in the basement, being cut open, recovering, being cut open again, until they didn't even look human. Uni said it best in his interview. What the heck were they going to do? He couldn't even work at McDonald's looking the way he did. What good would help really do? Most of them didn't think it was worth being seen like that. The Somertons made sure they knew exactly what their prospects were and how much it would take to look even slightly normal again. Some of them killed themselves in that house. Others lent on the other people there for support, like Mur and Uni did. I never saw them apart after that first day, but that's what gets me to this day, I think. We rescued them, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't soon enough. It wasn't big enough. So yeah, Fawn lived in the woods with a few of them. The Somertons had operated on his legs so that his knees bent the other way. I didn't even know that was possible, but apparently people did it to beggar kids in India to make more money. Or at least that's what I've heard. They transplanted hair all down his legs so they were covered in fur. And like Unicorn, the last thing they did was transplant bone into 2 tiny bone horns on the top of his head. They told him it was human bone and didn't say where it was from. It was grafted straight onto his skull. Filing them to a shine gave him headaches for days afterwards, every 6 months for 15 years. Chyme was the worst of all. Chyme is short for chimera. In the legends, it's a lion and an additional head of a goat, and a snake for a tail. In the real world, it's a man with a cut Achilles tendon just like Uni. and a face that had been changed so much that it didn't look human, with hair added all around his face to make a mane, and a tail coming out of the base of his spine, all with human skin tattooed with green scales. I guess cutting it in like with Mur didn't do the trick for this one. The thing coming out of his back was titanium under a skin graft. It didn't look like a goat, but it didn't look like anything else either. Metal horns coming out through it and skin stretched over it. Imagine a goat skull with material stretched over it and you'd be close enough. It was easy enough to remove afterwards. Kime said he hadn't slept on his back for 5 years. He could shave the mane, but he was in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. The operations to fix the Achilles never worked. A lot of them refused further surgeries. They'd had enough for a lifetime. Harpy, could kind of walk. Her toes had been separated all the way down to look like bird's feet, as well as getting the backwards leg treatment like Fawn. Her hands removed, feathers tattooed all over her body. We never did find the tattoo artist who worked on all of them. And something called dermal implants were added all down her arms. It's like a piercing with only one end, so they could stick feathers into her, all the way down her arms and down her back. When we interviewed her, she still flapped her arms when she spoke like she was trained to. Tar was another one. Minotaur. Can I just tell you that he was a huge guy? They gave him horns. They changed his face until it didn't look like a face anymore. They built a labyrinth in the middle of their acres upon acres of land where nobody knew this was happening. He hadn't seen another person since the last operation. He just knew where they dropped off food and lived in a shelter at the center. I don't think they ever even looked at him since they finished. They just liked the idea of it. None of the other victims even knew he existed. Fawn brought him food and put it through the hatch, but didn't know who was on the other end of it. Cyclops was turned into exactly what you think. Somehow, Mr. Somerton had kept his eye socket mostly intact when he carved a single huge eye socket in his head and put both eyeballs in it. I'm not sure why he cut out his tongue. It wasn't following any legend. Cyclops had to write his statement down on paper. Deuce was short for Medusa. They'd grafted tunnels of skin all over her head and put metal reinforcements in so that they stuck out at all angles, tattooed green. They were so well grafted that she could feel them. Luckily for her, there were no mirrors in her room after the modifications. Part of the myth, you see. Griff is the face I see most often in my sleep. It's not a human face. He had a beak made from silicone. Soft enough to move and eat with, but still a beak. He was on all fours like Uni, but had Harpy's treatment on some wings, which were apparently someone else's arms added to his sides. Daff was the last one we found. She lived up in a treehouse on the far side of the grounds. Fawn brought her food too. He seemed like their caretaker almost. She was half tree, like the legend where the nymph's dad turns her into a tree because some other god tried to rape her. I'm not a dad, but that wouldn't be my first move in that situation. There were dwarves too. You'd think they'd just kidnap midgets if they wanted them that badly, but that wasn't as fun for these guys. They were normal-sized people when they were kidnapped. Somerton amputated everything from their knees to their ankles and put their feet back on afterwards. Most of them couldn't walk like that, so they ended up on their hands and knees like so many others. There were animals too. A horse with what looked like wings from a swan to make a Pegasus. When we dug up the bodies, we found the skeleton of a dog with 2 additional heads that someone had tried to graft onto its spine. I think you get the picture. If you know a creature, something unnatural, something that should only exist in fiction, then they made it, or at least tried. There were 42 bodies buried. Once the modifications were complete, Somerton would put them in a mirrored room for a week. They'd be forced to look at what they'd become from every single angle, and told that even if they escaped, even if something happened to the Somertons, this is what they'd always be. From what I'd heard, they didn't even try to leave. They had their own rooms, made requests to Mrs. Somerton if they wanted something, and lived there. Each one had a way to behave, like Myrrh singing nonstop. It was either agree or get more drastic modifications, like gills cut into your throat, like a goat head put on your back. We'd hoped there'd be some documentation that maybe Mr. Somerton had been the type of psycho to detail his accomplishments. He wasn't. We found sketches, some rough medical records for each victim, and some instructions jotted down in the basement, some calculations for anesthetics, but that's about it. We did find a kind of diary, penned by Mrs. Somerton. She was the anonymous tip. Hey guys, stay tuned for the next part. And if you liked it, leave a like, go ahead and comment and let me know you're here and what you think about the story. Share it with all your friends. And don't forget, subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Have a good night. And remember, be good to each other.